A black CEO prepares to board her private jet for an important business trip. But what happens next will leave you speechless. Denied access to her own aircraft. Questioned at every turn. And humiliated by the crew. She's forced to prove her ownership over and over again. Just minutes later, a bold decision turns the tables completely, leading to a chain of events no one expected. Stay with me. This is a story about power, prejudice, and resilience that you can't miss. Before we dive in, comment below and share where you're watching from. And if this story inspires you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. It all started on what should have been an ordinary day. The sun hadn't yet fully risen when Elena Monroe arrived at the private airfield. Its pale light casting long shadows across the tarmac. She sat in the back of her sleek black sedan, her hand absently smoothing the crease in her slate gray dress pants. Her thoughts already far ahead of her schedule. London by evening, Tokyo within 48 hours. It was a tight itinerary, but she was used to such demands. For years, she'd navigated the corridors of power with precision, earning every accolade, every dollar, every inch of respect. And now, she thought, staring out at the morning haze, this plane, a symbol of her success, was supposed to make it all a little easier. But the world rarely grants a black woman her victories without resistance. The security gate loomed ahead, guarded by a man whose belly strained against the buttons of his uniform. His name tag read Morrison, but the scowl on his face suggested he found more pride in his posture than his position. The car slowed, and the driver rolled down the window. "We're here for Ms. Monroe," the driver said, his tone professional but firm. Morrison leaned down, peering past the driver to catch a glimpse of Elena in the back seat. His gaze lingered just a moment too long, his lips curling into what might have been a sneer. Or perhaps just the kind of smile given to someone you don't think belongs. "Hangar 7, you said?" Morrison's voice carried a familiar tone. Slow and exaggerated, as though he were speaking to someone who might not understand. "Yes," Elena answered, her own tone sharp, controlled. Morrison straightened, his hands resting on his hips. "That's private access, reserved for owners. You understand." Elena's jaw tightened. She'd heard this script before. Delivered in boardrooms, hotels, and once, humiliatingly, in her own corporate lobby. Private access, reserved for owners. The words carried a weight. A presumption that someone like her, a black woman, must be lost, mistaken, or, worse, trying to cheat the system. She leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but steely. "I understand perfectly. The plane in Hangar 7 belongs to me. My name is Elena Monroe. You'll find it on file." There was a pause, just long enough to let her know he didn't believe her. Morrison huffed, retreating to his small office to check the records. The car idled. Elena didn't move. She'd learned long ago that indignation, even righteous, had no place here. Instead, she waited, the tension in her chest growing with every passing second. The gate finally creaked open, and the car rolled forward. No apology was offered, not even the forced politeness she'd come to expect. It was a small indignity, but its sting lingered, not because it was surprising but because it was so predictable. She had paid for this jet with her own money. Yet here she was, having to prove herself at the gate. As they neared Hangar 7, Elena caught sight of the plane. A sleek, charcoal and silver marvel, its tail fin emblazoned with the subtle yet unmistakable logo of her company. It should have filled her with pride, but her pulse only quickened with a sense of foreboding. Outside the jet, a cluster of crew members stood in a loose semicircle. The captain, a tall man with salt and pepper hair, was the first to notice her. His gaze was sharp, assessing, as though weighing whether to greet her or wait for someone more fitting to arrive. Elena stepped out of the car, her shoulders squared, her handbag slung casually over her arm. She offered a polite smile. "Good morning, I'm Elena Monroe. Are we ready for an on-time departure?" The captain exchanged a glance with his co-pilot, then turned back to her. His expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened, the corners of his mouth tightening. "We're awaiting the owner," he said, his voice clipped. Elena stared at him, incredulous. "I am the owner," she said, her voice firm but composed. The captain raised an eyebrow. Skepticism plain on his face. Behind him, one of the flight attendants, a woman with a severe bun and an even more severe expression, stepped forward. We were told the principal passenger was Mr. Monroe. The woman said. Her tone was professional, but the subtext was unmistakable. You don't belong here. Elena felt her anger rise. Hot and sharp, but she pushed it down. She'd learned long ago that displays of anger, no matter how justified, were never seen as righteous in someone like her. They were seen as threatening. She reached into her bag, pulling out her ID and the registration documents for the plane. Here's my identification. Here's the registration. If you need further proof, feel free to call your headquarters. The flight attendant took the documents, her hands moving too slowly, as though each motion was an act of protest. Elena watched as the woman scanned the papers, her eyes darting back to Elena's face, searching for a flaw, a reason to deny what was plainly true. Finally, the woman handed them back. There seems to have been some confusion, she said, her tone far from apologetic. No confusion, Elena replied, her voice low, steady, just assumptions. The captain turned away, muttering something to the co-pilot. Elena couldn't hear the words, but the dismissive wave of his hand spoke volumes. As Elena ascended the steps to her own plane, she felt the weight of their stares on her back. Each step felt like an act of defiance, not just against these individuals but against the world they represented, a world that refused to see her as she was. This is my plane, she thought. I own it, but somehow, I'm still the one who has to prove it. Above her, the sky stretched wide and endless, a promise of freedom, but here on the ground, the chains of doubt and prejudice still held fast. The engines hummed as the plane prepared for takeoff. Elena settled into her seat, her composure intact but her spirit bruised. This flight was supposed to be a testament to how far she'd come, a symbol of triumph. Instead, it was a reminder of how far there still was to go. And the journey, she knew, had only just begun. The cabin of the jet was everything Elena Monroe had envisioned when she commissioned its design. Cream leather seats so soft they seemed to envelop you, polished wood panels glowing warmly under the cabin lights, and the faint scent of cedar that spoke of luxury without shouting it. It was supposed to be her sanctuary in the sky, a space that symbolized not just her success but her independence from the constraints of commercial travel and, more importantly, the invisible walls that often surrounded her in other spheres of life. Yet even here, at 40,000 feet, she couldn't shake the feeling of being under siege. The lead flight attendant, Laura Hathaway, stood stiffly at the front of the cabin, clipboard in hand, her posture as rigid as her perfectly tied bun. Miss Monroe, she said, her voice carefully measured, before we proceed, we need to verify some additional details regarding your passenger manifest. Elena raised an eyebrow, her fingers tightening slightly around the armrest of her seat. I thought we resolved all of this on the ground, she replied, her tone polite but sharp. Laura's lips pressed into a thin line. Yes. Well, there appear to be discrepancies in the documentation provided by the staffing agency. The passenger listed as the owner, she paused for emphasis, her eyes flicking briefly to Elena, is identified as Mr. Monroe. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Elena exhaled slowly, forcing herself to remain calm. Mr. Monroe doesn't exist. The plane is mine, and every document you've seen confirms that. Are there any other questions about my identity? Or are we ready for takeoff? Behind Laura, the captain, Richard Morris, leaned against the doorframe of the cockpit, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. His silence was more infuriating than Laura's questioning, a passive confirmation that her ownership was a matter of debate among the crew. Elena met his gaze, holding it until he finally looked away. There's no need to be defensive, Miss Monroe, Laura said, her tone softening but only slightly. We're just following protocol. Protocol. The word grated on Elena's nerves. Not because of what it meant but because of what it implied. Protocol was always the excuse, the shield behind which bias and bigotry hid. It was protocol that asked her to prove her qualifications again and again in boardrooms. Even after she'd closed billion-dollar deals, It was protocol that stopped her at the gates of her own private airfield. And now, here it was, trailing her into the sanctity of her own plane. I'm not being defensive, Elena said evenly, her voice controlled. I'm being clear. The next time you refer to me, it will be as the owner of this plane. Is that understood? Laura blinked, her composure faltering for just a moment. Behind her, Captain Morris shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the cockpit as though considering whether to intervene. Finally, Laura nodded. Understood, Miss Monroe. But the words felt hollow. A concession made without conviction. As Laura retreated to her station, Elena leaned back in her seat, her pulse still racing. She was used to these battles. The constant push and pull of having to assert her presence in spaces that resisted her. But something about this moment felt heavier, more insidious. It wasn't just the doubt. It was the quiet collusion of it all. The unspoken agreement between people like Laura and Morris that someone like Elena didn't belong. Even when she had every right to be here. The engines roared to life, the vibrations coursing through the cabin as the plane taxied toward the runway. Elena stared out the window. The sprawling tarmac below bathed in the pale light of dawn. The plane lifted into the air, the world falling away beneath it. For a moment, she felt the familiar exhilaration of flight, the sense of being untethered from the earth. But it didn't last. The tension in the cabin was palpable, like a low hum just beneath the surface. Laura moved through her pre-flight duties with a brisk efficiency that bordered on coldness. Marcus, the younger flight attendant, approached Elena with a glass of water, his nervous smile a stark contrast to Laura's frosty demeanor. Let me know if you need anything, Miss Monroe, he said quietly, almost conspiratorially. Elena nodded, appreciating the gesture but knowing it wouldn't change the undercurrent of hostility that seemed to pervade the crew. An hour into the flight, turbulence rocked the plane, sending a jolt through the cabin. Elena instinctively reached for the armrest as Laura's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, the seatbelt sign is now on. Please remain seated while we navigate some minor air disturbances. The turbulence was mild, but Elena couldn't shake the feeling that it was a prelude to something more unsettling. She glanced toward the cockpit, where she could just make out the shadow of Captain Morris in his seat. His posture was relaxed, his head tilted as though in casual conversation with the co-pilot. But then she noticed something else, the faint sound of raised voices. It was coming from the galley, where Laura was speaking to someone, likely Marcus, in a hushed but urgent tone. Elena couldn't make out the words, but the tension in Laura's voice was unmistakable. Curiosity and frustration pulled at her. She had wanted this flight to be an escape, a moment of calm before the whirlwind of meetings and negotiations that awaited her in London and Tokyo. Instead, it felt like yet another battlefield, the kind where the enemy wasn't an individual but an idea, a belief so ingrained that it didn't need to be spoken aloud to be felt. By the time the turbulence subsided, Elena's patience was wearing thin. She pressed the call button at her seat, and within moments, Laura appeared, her expression neutral but her eyes betraying a flicker of irritation. Yes, Miss Monroe? Elena tilted her head, her gaze steady. I'd like an update on our flight path and ETA. Can you confirm that we're still on schedule? Laura hesitated, just long enough for the pause to feel deliberate. I'll check with the captain, she said finally. As Laura disappeared into the cockpit, Elena felt a knot of anger twist in her chest. It wasn't just about the delays or the subtle slights. It was the way they compounded, building on one another until they formed a wall she had to climb just to claim what was already hers. From behind the closed cockpit door, Elena heard murmurs, followed by the faint click of a radio. Her fingers tapped impatiently against the armrest. She had faced these moments 1,000 times before, in settings far more public than this one. But somehow, this felt more personal, more pointed. When Laura returned, her face was carefully blank. We're still on schedule, she said. The captain wanted me to let you know that everything is under control. Elena didn't miss the subtle emphasis on the captain, as though it were a reminder of who held the authority here. She simply nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. Thank you, she said, her voice steady. As Laura walked away, Elena's gaze shifted back to the window. Outside, The clouds stretched endlessly, their soft edges belying the storm that churned beneath them. She had learned long ago that the sky was never truly free. Even here, among the clouds, the weight of the world followed her. The plane soared above the clouds, the rhythmic hum of the engines offering a false sense of calm. Elena Monroe leaned back in her seat, her fingers absently tracing the outline of the armrest. But her thoughts were far from peaceful. Beneath her composure, a storm raged. Each passing mile, each silent moment of disdain from the crew, only added to the weight pressing down on her chest. She had flown many times, crossed oceans in search of business deals, shaken hands with billionaires, and negotiated with power brokers. But this time, the skies felt more oppressive than the conference rooms she had conquered. The same old questions followed her, persistent as the sound of the plane's engines. Am I here because I earned it? Or am I here because they had no choice but to acknowledge my place? Why must I keep proving that I belong? She tried to push the thoughts aside. But the truth was, the question always lingered. Why should she have to prove herself at all? The flight had been smooth until now. The turbulence, though minor, felt like a metaphor for the subtle, almost invisible turbulence that had been following her entire life. No one needed to see the waves beneath the surface, they just needed to feel them. She could sense it in the way Captain Morris avoided eye contact. The way Laura moved with that stiff professionalism. Always polite, never quite warm. The first flicker of tension had been when they had questioned her at the gate. The second, when they still hadn't fully accepted her presence aboard her own plane. But now, high above the Atlantic, in the cold, indifferent skies, Elena realized that this tension was no longer an anomaly. It was the texture of her existence. A constant undercurrent that surged stronger with every step she took. Every victory she won. The captain's voice came through the intercom. Gruff and disinterested. Ladies and gentlemen, we're encountering some air disturbances. Please fasten your seatbelts. His words were clipped, as though his only concern was ensuring that she was still securely strapped in. Elena's eyes shifted toward the cockpit. It was a small thing. Perhaps an insignificant thing. But the way he spoke to her was still a reminder. She was not the one in charge. Elena felt the unease simmering beneath the surface. It wasn't just the turbulence that caused her pulse to quicken, but the underlying sense that something was always just a bit off. Something always required extra explanation, extra validation, as if she had not already proven herself. She had earned her place in every room she entered. Yet she had to convince these people she belonged here. 2 minutes later, she was interrupted by a soft tap on her shoulder. Marcus, the younger flight attendant, stood there, his face a mixture of apology and unease. Miss Monroe, I'm sorry to bother you. But could you please come to the cockpit? We're having some issues with the navigation system. Just a quick check, to make sure everything is running smoothly. Elena nodded slowly, her gaze shifting between the earnestness in Marcus's eyes and the dismissive, indifferent stance of the other attendants. I'll be right there, she replied, her voice calm, though her mind was beginning to spiral. The walk to the cockpit felt longer than it should have, the narrow aisle seeming to stretch with each step. As she neared, Elena could hear low voices from inside, their words muffled but carrying the faintest undertone of frustration. She paused outside the door for just a moment, trying to steady the restless energy rising in her chest. This was not just a simple maintenance issue. She realized, it was something more insidious. Something that had been building quietly beneath the surface. She knocked once, twice. A few seconds later, the door clicked open. Captain Morris, his face stern, gestured for her to enter. Miss Monroe, he began, his tone formal. We've encountered a discrepancy in the system. It appears there's been a mix-up with the flight route. We need to recheck the coordinates before we proceed. A recheck. Elena's pulse quickened. This was the third issue she'd encountered since boarding. The first was the questioning at the gate. The second was the uneasy tension in the cabin. And now this. Another glitch. Another obstacle to navigate. Elena glanced at the flight map displayed on the screen. Everything seemed to be in order. What exactly is the issue? She asked, her voice steady but laced with growing impatience. The captain hesitated. The system seems to have us deviating slightly to avoid a weather front. We may need to adjust the flight plan to ensure we stay on track. Alina's eyes narrowed. I've reviewed the weather data. There's no major storm ahead. I believe we're fine to proceed on the original path. A flicker of doubt passed over Captain Morris's face, but it quickly vanished as he glanced at the co-pilot. There was a tension in the air that felt more and more like a test. A test not just of her knowledge, but of her patience, of her very right to make decisions that affected the flight. Miss Monroe, with all due respect, I believe we should. Quote, I'm the owner of this plane. Elena interjected, her voice colder now, and I've made my decision. Keep the original route. Captain Morris's jaw tightened, but he gave a curt nod. Understood, Miss Monroe. As Elena returned to her seat, she could feel the eyes of the attendants on her. The weight of their judgment lingered, an invisible pressure that made it harder to breathe. She glanced toward the cockpit, wondering if they were still second-guessing her orders. The turbulence worsened, a jolt rocked the plane, and Elena's stomach lurched. But this time, it wasn't the plane's movements that disturbed her most. It was the way her own presence had been questioned yet again. It was the way she had to fight for every ounce of respect she was due. Why, she wondered, was it that the further you rose, the more you were made to feel small? Why was it that despite every achievement, there was always someone willing to second-guess you? Someone willing to tell you that you didn't belong? The answers to those questions didn't come in the form of words, but in the quiet moments. The moments where she realized that the battle for dignity was never truly over. No matter how high you flew. And as the plane continued to climb through the turbulent skies, Elena couldn't help but feel the weight of her reality, that the clouds above were far lighter than the ones she carried within. The turbulence outside was nothing compared to the storm brewing within, as the Gulfstream G650 steadied itself against unseen winds. Elena Monroe's mind raced. The tension wasn't just in the cabin, it was everywhere. In the clipped tones of the captain's announcements, in the wary glances exchanged among the crew, and in the heavy silence that hung over her like a weight she couldn't shake. This wasn't just about a flight gone awry. This was about something deeper, older, something that had followed her all her life, whispering doubts into the ears of people who should have known better. Something that had taught her to brace herself, always, for the next challenge, the next indignity. As the plane leveled out, Elena tried to focus. She opened her laptop, pulling up the presentation she was supposed to give in London. The numbers blurred on the screen as her thoughts drifted back to the confrontation in the cockpit. It wasn't the first time her authority had been questioned, and she doubted it would be the last. But there was something uniquely exhausting about having to fight these battles even here, in a space she owned, at a height where the petty concerns of the world should have fallen away. A knock at the door of the private cabin startled her. It was Marcus, the young flight attendant, holding a tray with a glass of water. Miss Monroe, he said, his voice low and hesitant. Is there anything else I can get you? She studied his face for a moment, noting the faint trace of unease behind his smile. He was nervous, not because of her, but because of everything swirling around them. No, thank you, Marcus, she replied, softening her tone. But can I ask you something? He blinked, unsure but obliging. Of course. Does the captain have a problem with me? Marcus hesitated. It was the kind of hesitation that said more than words ever could. Finally, he leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't think it's personal, Miss Monroe, but he wasn't expecting you. He thought, well, we all thought, the owner would be someone else. Someone else, she repeated, her voice even. She didn't need him to elaborate. Marcus nodded, his face flushing with embarrassment. It's just the way things are sometimes. But I'm sorry if it's made you uncomfortable. Uncomfortable. The word felt woefully inadequate. Like calling a hurricane a little storm. But she didn't blame him for the phrasing. He was trying, in his own way, to bridge the gap between what was happening and what he thought he could say. Thank you for your honesty, she said at last, offering a small nod. He lingered for a moment, as if he wanted to say more, but then he retreated, leaving her alone with her thoughts. An hour later, the turbulence returned, more severe this time. The seatbelt sign dinged on. and the plane jolted violently enough to make Elena grip her armrests. Over the intercom, Captain Morris's voice crackled through. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're encountering a stronger weather system than anticipated. We may need to adjust our course to avoid it. Please remain seated." Elena's jaw tightened. She glanced at the flight tracker on the small screen in front of her seat. The route had already deviated once, adding nearly 30 minutes to the flight time. She had seen the weather reports before boarding. There hadn't been any major storms along their path. The plane jolted again, and Elena decided she'd had enough. She unbuckled her seatbelt and made her way toward the cockpit. Laura Hathaway, the lead flight attendant, intercepted her in the aisle. "Miss Monroe, please return to your seat," Laura said, her tone firm but laced with something more. A faint trace of condescension. "I need to speak with the captain," Elena replied, her voice steady but unyielding. Laura's expression hardened. "The captain is busy ensuring the safety of this flight. If you have concerns, you can relay them through me." Elena's eyes narrowed. "I am the owner of this plane. I'll speak to the captain myself." For a moment, they stood there, locked in a silent standoff. Then, reluctantly, Laura stepped aside, her lips pressing into a thin line. Elena knocked on the cockpit door, and it opened after a brief pause. Inside, Captain Morris and the co-pilot, Anita Rodriguez, were focused on the instruments. The captain glanced at her, his expression a mixture of annoyance and wariness. "Miss Monroe," he said, his tone clipped, "this is highly irregular. So is this deviation." Elena shot back, gesturing toward the flight map. "What's going on?" Captain Morris straightened in his seat, his jaw tightening. "There's a storm system ahead. I'm making the necessary adjustments to ensure everyone's safety. There's no storm large enough to warrant this much delay," she countered. "I reviewed the weather reports before we took off." The co-pilot, Anita, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. For a moment, it seemed like she might speak. But then she looked back at the instruments. Avoiding Elena's gaze. "I don't need to justify my decisions to you," Captain Morris said, his voice rising slightly. "I'm the captain. My priority is safety, not convenience." Elena took a step closer, her voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "And my priority is ensuring that this flight isn't being delayed for reasons that have nothing to do with safety. I've seen this before, Captain. If you have a problem with me, say it outright, but don't hide behind technicalities." His face reddened, and for a moment, she thought he might explode. But instead, he turned back to the controls, muttering under his breath. Anita finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "The weather system isn't severe, Captain. We can adjust slightly and stay closer to the original route without compromising safety." Captain Morris shot her a sharp look. But she didn't back down. Elena nodded. "Good. Make it happen." Without waiting for a response, she turned and left the cockpit, her heart pounding. The confrontation had left her shaken, but she refused to let it show. Back in her seat, Elena stared out the window at the endless expanse of clouds. The plane had steadied again, but the tension in the cabin was thicker than ever. She had asserted her authority, but the cost was a reminder of how easily it could be questioned. It wasn't just about this flight. It was about every room, every decision, every battle she'd had to fight simply to claim what was already hers. And as the plane continued its journey across the Atlantic, Elena felt the weight of it all. Heavier than the skies themselves. Heavier than anything she had carried before. The horizon outside the window was streaked with the soft hues of dusk, a serene contrast to the storm brewing within the cabin. Elena Monroe sat stiffly in her seat, her hands folded in her lap, her face a mask of composure. But beneath her calm exterior, every nerve was taut, her thoughts racing in a loop of frustration and indignation. The turbulence had subsided, but the unease in the air was unmistakable. She had dared to challenge the authority of Captain Morris, dared to assert herself in a space where she was expected to quietly endure. And now the atmosphere was electric with unspoken tension. Elena was no stranger to these battles. No stranger to the quiet collusion of prejudice masquerading as professionalism. She had spent her life navigating spaces like this. Spaces where her presence was a disruption, her authority a provocation. But this time, The stakes felt higher. This was her plane, her domain, and yet she was being made to feel like an interloper, a guest overstaying her welcome. The flight attendant, Marcus, approached her seat cautiously, his expression a mix of apology and concern. "Miss Monroe," he said softly, "the captain asked me to inform you that we'll be slightly delayed in our arrival due to the earlier course adjustment. We should land in London around 10 p.m. local time." Alina's lips tightened. "Thank you, Marcus." He hesitated, as if wanting to say more, but then he nodded and retreated. She could see the unease in his posture, the way he glanced nervously toward the cockpit. He was trying, she thought. He was trying to navigate the same minefield she was, albeit from a different position. As the hours dragged on, Alina's patience wore thin. The Wi-Fi, which she had paid to ensure was the best available, was spotty at best, and every attempt to connect to her team in London ended in frustration. Her laptop screen froze mid-email for the third time, and she slammed it shut with a sigh. "Miss Monroe, would you like some tea?" It was Laura, the lead flight attendant, her tone as neutral as ever. "No, thank you," Alina replied without looking up. Laura lingered for a moment, then added, "I'd like to apologize for the confusion earlier. It wasn't personal, it was just protocol." Alina raised her head slowly, meeting Laura's gaze. "It's always just protocol, isn't it?" she said, her voice steady but sharp. "Funny how protocol seems to follow people like me more closely than others." Laura blinked, taken aback, but she didn't respond. Instead, she offered a tight nod and retreated to the galley. The plane jolted slightly as it began its descent. Alina glanced at the flight map on the screen. They were nearing London, and not a moment too soon. The day had felt endless. A series of microaggressions and subtle slights that had worn her down in ways she couldn't quite articulate. When the wheels finally touched down on the tarmac at London's private terminal, the relief was almost overwhelming. The plane taxied to the hangar, the glow of the terminal lights illuminating the sleek body of her Gulfstream. But as the engines powered down and the air stair extended, Alina knew the ordeal wasn't over. She gathered her belongings deliberately, her movements slow and precise. She would not rush, would not be hurried off her own plane. As she stepped into the aisle, she caught sight of Captain Morris emerging from the cockpit. His expression was guarded, his jaw set, but there was a flicker of something else there. Defiance, perhaps, or resentment. "Miss Monroe," he said stiffly, extending a hand. "I hope the flight was satisfactory." Alina paused, her gaze steady as she looked at his outstretched hand. She didn't take it. "I'll be filing a formal complaint with your staffing agency," she said calmly. "Expect to hear from my legal team." His face reddened slightly, but he said nothing. As Alina descended the air stair, the crisp London air hit her face, sharp and bracing. A black car was waiting on the tarmac, its driver standing at attention. Her assistant, Mary Ann, was already there, her phone in hand, her expression one of relief mixed with concern. "Alina," Mary Ann said, hurrying to meet her, "are you all right? The board is waiting at the hotel. They've been asking for updates all evening." "I'm fine," Alina replied, though the words felt hollow. She wasn't fine. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but she couldn't let that show. Not now. As they drove away from the airfield, the lights of London blurring past the car windows, Alina allowed herself a moment to breathe. She had made it. The flight was over, but the battle wasn't. The next morning, Alina sat in a conference room at the Mayfair Hotel, her posture impeccable, her expression composed. The board members of her company had gathered for the meeting, their voices low as they exchanged pleasantries. "Alina," Roger Thompson, one of the senior board members, said as he approached her, "heard there was some difficulty with the flight." She offered a small, tight smile. "Just a misunderstanding," she said. He studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "If there's anything the board can do to support you, you need only ask." "Thank you, Roger," she replied, "but I can handle it." And she would. Later that evening, as she prepared for her next flight to Tokyo, Alina summoned the flight crew to a private meeting room at the terminal. Captain Morris, Laura, Marcus, and the others filed in. their expressions a mix of apprehension and defiance. Elena stood at the head of the room. Her arms crossed. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough to command attention. What happened on that flight was unacceptable. She began. From the moment I stepped onto the tarmac to the moment we landed, I was treated as though I didn't belong. On my own plane. She let the words hang in the air, her gaze sweeping over the crew. Captain Morris, she said, her tone colder now, your behavior was the most egregious. Not only did you question my authority, but you also endangered this flight with unnecessary delays and deviations. As of this moment, you're relieved of duty. You're fired. He opened his mouth to protest, but she silenced him with a raised hand. I don't want excuses, she said. I want results. And I expect every person on my team to understand one thing. Respect isn't optional. It's required. As Captain Morris stormed out, Elena felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The skies ahead were still uncertain, but for the first time in days, she felt like she could breathe. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. But she had won this round. And that, for now, was enough. London's early morning air hung heavy with fog, a grey shroud that blurred the sharp edges of the city. From her hotel window, Elena Monroe watched the world below stir to life, her reflection faint against the glass. She looked composed, the lines of her tailored blazer sharp and precise. But inside, a tempest brewed. The events of the previous day lingered like a bitter aftertaste. She had fired Captain Morris and delivered a speech that left the crew shaken. But the weight of what had transpired followed her. It wasn't just the flight, or even the disrespect. It was the familiar ache of carrying too much for too long. The knock at the door startled her. Mary Ann entered, phone in hand, her expression unreadable. Elena, she began, her voice soft but steady. The story's out. Elena turned, her eyebrows lifting slightly. What story? Mary Ann handed her the phone. On the screen was an article headline. Black CEO denied access to her own private jet. A tale of power and prejudice at 40,000 feet. Below it, a photograph of Elena, taken without her knowledge, as she stepped off the plane in London. Her posture was regal, her expression calm, but the caption beneath told a different story. Elena Monroe, CEO of Monroe Enterprises, faced humiliation aboard her own private jet after being questioned by her flight crew. Sources say the incident highlights systemic issues of racism and sexism in high-end travel. Elena read the words slowly, her chest tightening with each line. She scrolled further, finding snippets of commentary from anonymous sources. She didn't act like an owner, one crew member reportedly said. We just followed protocol. The anger bubbled to the surface. Hot and sharp, she handed the phone back to Mary Ann, her jaw tightening. Who leaked this? We don't know yet, Mary Ann replied, her tone apologetic. But it's spreading fast. The media is framing it as a racial issue. Some outlets are even calling it a power play. Elena exhaled sharply. She had always been careful to control the narrative surrounding her public image. But this was different. This wasn't just a story about her. It was about the persistent shadow of prejudice. About what it meant to challenge the unspoken rules of who belonged where. What's the plan? She asked, her voice calm but firm. Mary Ann hesitated. You could issue a denial. Say it was a misunderstanding. Quote. No, Elena interrupted. We don't deny the truth. Mary Ann nodded, relief flickering in her eyes. Then we need to control the message. I've drafted a statement emphasizing your commitment to inclusivity and professionalism. It frames this as an opportunity to lead by example. Elena considered this, her mind racing. She had spent her entire career navigating the delicate balance between asserting herself and appeasing others. But this time, she decided, there would be no compromise. By noon, the statement was released. Monroe Enterprises confirms that Miss Elena Monroe encountered issues during her recent flight due to administrative errors and personnel misconduct. These events underscore the need for ongoing efforts to address prejudice and ensure respect in all spaces. Miss Monroe has taken immediate action to remedy the situation, reaffirming her commitment to equity and professionalism. The response was measured, but the backlash was anything but. Social media erupted. The hashtags jet, white, black and power in flight trending within hours. Some praised Alina's courage, calling her a role model for standing up against systemic bias. Others accused her of overreacting, framing the incident as a wealthy woman playing the race card. 2 days later, as Alina prepared to board her newly staffed jet for Tokyo, the tension reached a boiling point. Reporters swarmed the terminal, their cameras flashing, their voices a cacophony of questions. Miss Monroe, do you believe this incident reflects broader issues in corporate aviation? Were you racially profiled by your own crew? Do you plan to pursue legal action? Alina paused at the base of the air stair, turning to face the crowd. She hadn't planned to speak, but something in their relentless questioning stirred a resolve deep within her. Let me be clear, she began, her voice carrying above the din. This isn't just about one flight, or one crew, or even one industry. It's about the unspoken assumptions that follow people like me wherever we go. It's about the quiet ways in which our presence is questioned, our authority undermined, and our dignity challenged. The crowd fell silent, her words cutting through the chaos. I've spent my life breaking barriers, and I won't stop now. If this experience teaches us anything, it's that progress isn't passive. It requires action, accountability, and a refusal to accept anything less than the respect we deserve. With that, she turned and ascended the stairs, her head held high. Once aboard, the difference was immediate. The new captain, Ethan Sinclair, greeted her with a warm smile and a professional nod. The cabin crew, Marcus, Bianca, and the recently demoted Laura, moved with quiet efficiency, their demeanor respectful but not obsequious. For the first time in days, Alina felt a sense of calm. As the plane climbed into the sky, she stared out the window, the clouds parting beneath them. The turbulence, for now, was behind her, but she knew better than to believe it was gone entirely. Prejudice, she thought, was like the air itself, invisible but everywhere, shaping the world in ways most people never noticed, until they couldn't ignore it anymore. She closed her eyes, letting the steady hum of the engines soothe her. She was tired, yes, but she was also resolute. Because no matter how high she had to climb, no matter how many battles she had to fight, she would never let the world dictate the limits of her sky. The Gulf Stream hummed steadily at 40,000 feet, a picture of engineered perfection. Yet the air inside the cabin carried a weight no machine could dissipate. Alina Monroe sat near the window, her gaze fixed on the vast expanse of the Pacific below. The meeting in Tokyo loomed ahead, but her thoughts were consumed by the quiet storm brewing within. The crew, though professional, moved with the careful precision of people walking on eggshells. The newly appointed captain, Ethan Sinclair, had handled the flight with a smooth confidence that spoke of years of experience. But Alina could sense the tension beneath his polite demeanor. He was watching, waiting for any sign that his predecessor's failure might cast a shadow over his own. In the galley, Laura Hathaway, the demoted lead flight attendant, hovered nervously. Every interaction with Alina was accompanied by an air of contrition, though her attempts to mend fences were met with measured responses. It was Marcus who finally broke the silence, offering Alina a cup of tea with a small, hesitant smile. Miss Monroe, he said softly, I hope this flight is more comfortable for you. Alina accepted the cup, her expression softening slightly. Thank you, Marcus. It is. He nodded and retreated, but not before Alina caught the faintest trace of relief in his posture. She sipped the tea, the warmth spreading through her. But it wasn't enough to quiet the unease that lingered. The first jolt of turbulence hit unexpectedly, a sharp drop that sent loose items skidding across the cabin floor. Alina gripped the armrests, her body tensing instinctively. Over the intercom, Ethan's voice was calm but firm. Ladies and gentlemen, we're encountering unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We'll climb to a higher altitude to find smoother air. The plane shuddered again, and Alina's pulse quickened. She wasn't afraid of flying. Not in the physical sense. But there was something about turbulence that always felt like a metaphor for her life. Unpredictable, uncontrollable, and demanding constant vigilance. As the cabin settled, she glanced toward the cockpit. For a moment, She considered walking up to check in with Ethan, but she decided against it. Trust, she reminded herself, had to start somewhere. Half an hour later, the turbulence returned, this time more severe. The plane dipped and swayed, the overhead bins rattling ominously. Laura moved down the aisle, checking seatbelts with a forced calm that did little to mask the worry etched on her face. "Miss Monroe," she said as she passed Alina's seat, her voice tight. "Can I get you anything to make you more comfortable?" "No, thank you," Elena replied evenly. Laura hesitated, as if searching for the right words. Then added, "I just want to say, I know things haven't been ideal. I'm trying to do better." Elena studied her for a moment, weighing the sincerity of her words. "I appreciate the effort," she said finally, "but doing better isn't about apologizing to me. It's about how you treat everyone, whether or not they own the plane." Laura's cheeks flushed, and she nodded before retreating to the galley. The plane jolted violently, and for a moment, Elena felt the undeniable pull of fear. The intercom crackled again, and this time, it was Ethan's co-pilot, Anita Rodriguez, who spoke. "Apologies for the rough ride, folks. We're navigating a dense weather system, but everything is under control." Elena closed her eyes, willing herself to relax, but her mind refused to quiet. The turbulence didn't let up, and an hour later, Marcus returned with an update. "Miss Monroe," he said, his voice low, "the captain wanted you to know we might need to reroute if the weather doesn't clear soon. It could delay our arrival by about an hour." Elena's jaw tightened. Another delay, another deviation. It wasn't anyone's fault, not this time, but it felt like the universe conspiring to test her patience. "Thank you, Marcus," she said, keeping her tone neutral. He nodded and left, leaving Elena alone with her thoughts. As the hours passed, the turbulence eased, but the atmosphere in the cabin remained tense. Elena finally stood, stretching her legs, and made her way to the cockpit. She knocked lightly on the door, and Ethan opened it, his expression a mixture of professionalism and weariness. "Miss Monroe," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "How are we looking?" she asked, her gaze flicking to the instruments. "We've cleared the worst of it," Ethan replied. "We're back on track for Tokyo. Shouldn't be more than a slight delay." Elena nodded, studying his face. "You're handling it well. Thank you," he said, his voice steady. "And for what it's worth, I'm sorry for what happened before. I know you've heard enough apologies, but I want you to know it won't happen again. Not on my watch." She held his gaze, searching for any sign of insincerity, but found none. "I believe you," she said simply. As she left the cockpit, she felt a faint glimmer of hope. Perhaps, she thought, trust could be rebuilt, piece by piece. The final hours of the flight passed without incident. The cabin quiet save for the occasional sound of glasses clinking or soft murmurs from the crew. As they began their descent into Tokyo, Elena glanced out the window at the city lights below, their glow spreading like a promise across the darkened landscape. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to exhale. The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. But this leg, at least, was coming to a close. The plane touched down smoothly, and as it taxied to the private terminal, Elena felt a sense of calm she hadn't expected. She had faced turbulence, both literal and metaphorical, and came through it intact. But the challenges ahead loomed large, and she knew the fight for respect, for dignity, was far from over. And yet, as she stepped off the plane and into the cool Tokyo night, she felt a quiet resolve settle over her. The sky might be vast and unpredictable, but it was hers to navigate. And no storm, no prejudice, no unspoken judgment would keep her grounded. The Tokyo night pulsed with life, its neon glow casting jagged reflections on the black glass of Elena Monroe's hotel room. The city was a symphony of contradictions. Ancient traditions coexisting with modern ambition. Harmony shadowed by quiet resistance. Elena stood at the window, her reflection a silhouette against the sprawling skyline. She had landed safely, navigated the turbulence both in the air and within herself. But the echoes of her journey lingered. The meeting with her Tokyo partners had gone well. The deal was signed, the handshake firm, the smiles genuine, or at least convincing enough. But as always, beneath the surface of professional decorum lay a quiet tension. Questions unspoken but ever present. How had she come to command such power? Did she truly belong at the helm of an empire? Elena had learned to navigate these undercurrents. To meet doubt with clarity and silence with resolve. Yet she was weary. The kind of weariness that isn't about the body but the soul. A tiredness born from the unending labor of proving, over and over, that she belonged. The morning of her return flight dawned crisp and clear. The air carrying a bite that hinted at the approaching winter. Elena arrived at the hangar early. Her luggage neatly packed. Her mind already focused on the next challenge awaiting her in New York. Ethan Sinclair greeted her at the base of the air stair. His posture straight. His expression professional but warm. "Miss Monroe," he said with a slight nod. "Everything is prepped for departure. Weather's clear, and we're set for an on-time arrival." "Thank you, Captain," she replied, appreciating the steadiness in his tone. As she ascended the steps, Marcus met her at the top, offering a genuine smile. "Welcome back, Miss Monroe," he said. The atmosphere aboard the plane felt different this time. The tension that had clouded her previous flights was gone, replaced by an almost palpable sense of purpose. Laura Hathaway, though demoted, moved through the cabin with quiet efficiency. Her earlier stiffness replaced with something resembling humility. Elena settled into her seat, exhaling as the engines roared to life. She watched the ground fall away, Tokyo's glittering skyline shrinking until it was just a memory. Hours into the flight, the sky stretched wide and unbroken, a canvas of endless blue. Elena worked steadily, reviewing documents and responding to emails. The steady hum of the engines a soothing backdrop. But as the plane crossed the international dateline, her focus wavered. She closed her laptop and stared out the window, her thoughts drifting. She thought of the past week, of the security guard at the gate who had questioned her right to enter, of Captain Morris and his veiled defiance, of the turbulence both literal and figurative. Each moment felt like a piece of a larger puzzle, one she had been trying to assemble her entire life. It wasn't just about her. It never had been. It was about the millions of others who faced the same quiet indignities. The same insidious doubts. People who weren't given the benefit of the doubt. Who were made to feel small in spaces they had every right to occupy. Her thoughts were interrupted by Marcus, who appeared with a tray. "Tea, Miss Monroe?" he asked. His voice gentle. She nodded, offering a small smile. "Thank you, Marcus." He placed the cup on the table beside her, then hesitated. "I just wanted to say, it's been an honor working with you. I've learned a lot this week." Elena studied him for a moment, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. "Thank you, Marcus. It's been a learning experience for all of us." As the flight neared New York, Ethan's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into JFK. Weather conditions are clear, and we'll be landing ahead of schedule. Thank you for flying with us." Elena felt a flicker of pride at his words. This was her plane, her crew, and this time, everything had gone exactly as it should. The plane touched down smoothly, the tires kissing the tarmac with barely a jolt. As the engines powered down, Elena gathered her belongings, preparing to disembark. At the base of the air stair, a car waited to take her to her next meeting, its sleek black frame gleaming in the sunlight. But before she stepped off, she turned to Ethan, Marcus, and the rest of the crew who had gathered at the cabin door. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice steady but warm. "For everything." Ethan nodded. "Safe travels, Miss Monroe." As Elena descended the steps, the crisp New York air filling her lungs, she felt something she hadn't felt in days: peace. Later that evening, as she sat in her office overlooking the city, Elena reflected on the week's events. The story of her flight had continued to circulate, sparking debates about race, privilege, and power. Some had praised her for standing her ground, while others had dismissed her as entitled. But Elena wasn't interested in public opinion. She knew that change was slow, often excruciatingly so. She knew that every victory, no matter how small, was part of a larger struggle. She glanced out the window at the city below, its lights shimmering like 1,000 tiny stars. The sky was vast, infinite, and full of possibilities. And she thought, This is what it means to truly own the sky. Not just to fly, but to rise above, to claim space, to refuse to be grounded by anyone's doubts or prejudices. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But for now, Elena allowed herself a moment of quiet triumph. Above the noise, above the doubt, above it all, she soared.